Sherlock Holmes once solved a baffling case through the slender clue of a watchdog that failed to bark. He referred to it as the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Clara Prather makes no pretensions to be a Sherlock Holmes, but the solution of one of her most popularly successful cases a few years ago hinged on a much more curious incident, the strange case of a bark in the nighttime without any dog. Thank you for tuning in. What you are about to hear is one of the most horrible true crime stories of dog murders that has ever been told. It happened in 1939 into 1940. The killer was so difficult to find that special means were employed to catch him. The whole story is just as remarkable as it is unsettling and deeply disturbing because the suspect targeted pet dogs, not roaming wild dogs. The selfishness of what he did is unbelievable, but law enforcement was not going to rest until justice was served. The article I'll be reading from is called Case of the 40 Dead Dogs. It is from True Detective magazine, May 1948. There are few pictures available, so you can listen to this narration like a podcast without having to watch. It was shortly before Christmas in 1939 that Clara was called in by District Attorney Francis B. Healy of Contra Costa County, across the bay from San Francisco, to crack a case which had had no publicity, but which had the entire southern section of the county up in arms. It was not a case of murder or robbery or other major felony, such as the woman detective had handled for Healy before. Technically, on the books, it did not involve a major crime. But to the residents of Orinda, the wealthy suburb in the foothills near Berkeley, it was a grim and ghastly thing, a series of crimes that in some cases struck harder and closer than even murder might have done. It was the crime of dog poisoning. In the past several months, no less than 45 dogs had been poisoned in the Orinda district. Most of them had died in agony. Post-mortems had indicated strychnine administered in chunks of meat. The victims ranged from kennel blue bloods to children's pets, from St. Bernards to terriers. In one household, 3 dogs had been stricken and died on the same night. Children who had lost their pets were inconsolable. One man who had lost a collie that had been his companion for 10 years told Healy that in his mind it constituted murder, and that he would shoot the poisoner on sight. There was talk of lynching. Groups of neighbors banded together and patrolled their yards and estates at night. Still the poisonings went on, the dog killer shifting his operations from one area to another. In the latter part of the year, toward Christmas, the strychnine deaths increased. There were 29 poisonings in 5 weeks. It seemed as though the dog killer were deliberately intensifying his activities in order to bring sorrow into the Orinda homes at Christmas. Owners of the surviving dogs tried to keep them locked in their yards, but still the poisoner managed to toss his deadly meat over fences and into wire enclosures. Pieces of poisoned meat, usually hamburger or a chunk of beef, were found at many spots, but no one had ever caught a glimpse of the poisoner at work. Naturally, there were all sorts of suspicions. Names were whispered of people who had expressed dislike of dogs, or who had a grudge against one or the other of the dog owners, but nothing definite pointed to anyone. The climax came when 2 pedigreed Cocker Spaniels, Duke and Cedric, owned by Richard Bruner, wealthy furniture dealer, and beloved by all the neighborhood, were poisoned in the same night. The animals were rushed to a veterinary. Cedric was saved after a night-long battle, but his father, Duke, died in Mrs. Bruner's arms. Bruner and his neighbors R.S. Ream, F.A. Kales, B.A. Wright, and C.R. Hodgkins, all of whom had suffered at the hands of the nocturnal poisoner, got together and organized a formal committee. Operating secretly, They enlisted others who had lost dogs, and all subscribed money to finance the hunt for the poisoner. The committee vowed to keep after him till he was caught. Constable Russell Stowe, the sole peace officer in the Orinda area, had been working practically full-time on the poisonings for weeks without success. The committee now urged him to greater efforts, and members volunteered to help him. Adopting the role of amateur detectives, the bereaved dog lovers checked on several possible suspects, but turned up nothing conclusive. Finally, on Constable Stowe's advice, they decided to hire a private detective, and Harry Bloom of Oakland was retained. Bloom moved unobtrusively into the area with several operatives and went to work. He succeeded in eliminating several suspects whose names had been given to him. The poisoned meat was planted while the suspects were under surveillance elsewhere. Bloom, watching the back roads for suspicious cars, dug up several suspects of his own and kept watch on them. Still, the poisonings went on. Shortly before Christmas, the committee decided to lay the matter before District Attorney Healy. Struck by their seriousness and by the extent of the poisonings, he assigned his chief investigator, Melvin Myatt, to look into the case. Myatt reported that the residents were so worked up that anything might happen, and recommended that Healy concentrate all his resources on catching the poisoner quickly. Healy, short of men and knowing that strangers would have a better chance of success than would regular peace officers, enlisted the aid of Clara Prather. In the past, Clara had handled several confidential criminal cases for the Contra Costa County District Attorney with conspicuous success. A dog lover herself, she needed no urgings to take the case. Healy outlined the facts to her and gave her the names of some suspects which the committee had turned in to him. "I want you to put everything you've got into this case, Clara," he told her. "Use all the operatives you need. I think you'll stand a good chance of cracking it, since a woman is less likely to arouse suspicion than a man. For all we know, this poisoner is operating right out in the open. He's smart and he dodges when he sees men around those roads. He knows a lot of men are out to get him, but he might get a little careless and not pay attention to a woman. Now, I'll give you a letter of introduction to some of these people." "No," Clara shook her head. "I'd rather not contact any of them just yet. I don't even want to talk to Harry Bloom. The best way is for me to operate independently and dig up what I can, entirely on my own. That way, any evidence I turn up will have more weight. If Bloom and I both get on the trail of the poisoner independently, that will be a lot more impressive in court than if we worked together." "I see your point," Healy nodded. "And there's no need for the committee or any of the people out there to know just yet that I'm working for you," Clara pointed out. "For all we know, the poisoner may be a member of the committee himself. Things like that have happened before. He may be right in there, leading the hunt. That would explain how he's been able to get by for so long. Just let me work this out in my own way, and I'll report to you as soon as I have something." They agreed on this procedure. Healy gave Clara a county map of the Orinda area and copies of the constable's reports on the poisonings. Clara went right to work. With one of her operatives, Harry Miller, she started out in her car that afternoon and drove around the Orinda area to familiarize herself with the roads. They were careful not to cover the same roads too often, lest the poisoner should note their car and become suspicious. They looked over the exact spots where the poisonings had taken place and marked them on the map of the vicinity. Late in the evening, Miller called Clara's attention to an old battered car with a lone man driving, which had passed them several times. Apparently the driver was circling the back roads just as they were. Clara followed the car at a safe distance. Coming suddenly around a turn, she had to apply her brakes quickly to keep from running into the suspected car. It was parked under a tree, half hidden by shrubbery. The driver leaned out and glared at Clara and Miller, and they could do nothing but glare back and drive on. They hurried into town and telephoned Sacramento to check the license number of the suspected car. To Clara's chagrin, they found it was registered to Harry Bloom, the Oakland detective. Presumably, at the same moment, Bloom's operative was checking on Clara's license number. Clara and Miller went back and toured the roads till late that night. In the course of their patrol, they encountered Stowe, the constable. They identified themselves and cautioned him to say nothing of their operations. There were no dogs poisoned that night, nor the next. Cruising about the roads together or separately, Clara and her operative ran into Bloom and his men. After several of these encounters, the detectives got to know each other's cars by sight, and toe-treading was soon eliminated. On the third night, while Clara was watching the home of one of the suspects that Healy had named, Constable Stowe sought her out to report that a fresh piece of poisoned meat had just been found on a road a couple of miles away. This eliminated that particular suspect, and Clara swiftly checked on two others, ringing their doorbells on some pretext and getting into conversations with them. She satisfied herself that none of these people were guilty. The same night, half a dozen other pieces of meat were found full of strychnine, but fortunately no dogs fell for the fatal bait. The detectives raced back and forth frantically, but the poisoner made good his escape as usual. Nevertheless, the night's work had served to put a number of suspects in the clear. Several nights went by with no more dogs poisoned and no poisoned meat found. Clara, consulting privately with District Attorney Healy and going over the reports, pointed out a peculiar circumstance. Look at these dates, and look at that calendar. For the past month, all the poisonings have been on Thursdays, Thursday afternoon or evening. The last time the meat was found on a Thursday. If we don't get another case until next Thursday, I'd say it's more than a coincidence. It looks as though the poisoner, for some reason, operates only on Thursday. Sure enough, it was not until the following Thursday afternoon that Constable Stowe found another piece of poisoned meat near the B.A. Wright estate. The sleuths converged on the area. Clara and Miller drove slowly along Minor Road. There was considerable traffic at that hour, most of the cars proceeding at a fast clip, in a hurry to get home. There was never very much transient traffic on that quiet residential road in the hills. Clara noticed a black Cadillac sedan cruising slowly and, it seemed, aimlessly. The gray-haired man at the wheel slowed down occasionally and looked around as though searching for landmarks. At length, at a wide space in the road, he made a U-turn and came back, passing the detective's car in the opposite direction. "Let's go after him," Miller urged. "That fellow doesn't look much like a detective, and there's something queer about the way he's driving." Clara turned around, and they followed the Cadillac, which had disappeared around a bend. Clara stepped on the gas to catch up with it. As they rounded the bend, the big sedan, which had slowed almost to a stop, was less than 100 yards in front of them. "Look!" Clara exclaimed. "Did you see that?" His hand flashed out of the window. It looked as though he threw something out. "I saw it. Let's go." As they spoke, the big Cadillac had picked up speed again and was churning dust behind it. "Did you get the license number?" "Yes," Miller was writing it down. 3G5471. They stopped with a jerk opposite the spot where the car had slowed. They leaped out and searched the ground in the gathering dusk. The poisoned meat, a chunk of steak specked with telltale white powder, lay under a roadside bush. It was fresh and clean. Obviously it had been thrown there. Clara wrapped the evidence in a handkerchief, and they took off after the car. Soon they sighted it again and trailed it at a safe distance. Darkness was falling rapidly. The driver of the Cadillac turned on his light. Clara left hers off to be less conspicuous. They followed the big sedan up and down several roads. 3 times it slowed and then picked up speed again. Each time, Clara and her operative stopped and made a quick search of the ground with flashlights, but found no more poisoned meat. Possibly the driver suspected that he was being followed. At length he turned up a side road and into the driveway of a large estate surrounded with a hedge. The detectives drove by, then circled back again. They saw the gray-haired man putting his car in the garage. "Well, shall we go after him?" Miller wanted to know. "Chances are there's some more poisoned meat in the car." "No," Clara decided. "We'll have to wait and get a little more on him. After all, there's no law against carrying poisoned meat in your car. Our cue is to catch him in the act of tossing it out." They drove slowly past the entrance to the estate and read the sign over the mailbox. "Dr. Francis M. Shook, Fairway Acres," Clara read. "That name's a new one on me. Well, we'll check on Dr. Shook." They drive up the road to where they had left another car parked, and Miller drove back to keep watch on Fairway Acres, while Clara hastened to find the constable. From Stowe, she learned that 3 other pieces of lethal meat had been found in the area through which they had followed the black sedan. Stowe checked the Cadillac's license number with his list of the cars of Orinda residents. "Yes, that's Dr. Shook's car, all right. Dr. Shook, let's see, I don't know much about him. He's only been living here a few years. Quiet fellow, about 60 years old, I guess. He's about the last person I'd suspect. Are you sure you got that license number right?" Clara was sure, and there was no doubt, from his description, that the gray-haired driver had been Dr. Shook himself. While they were talking, several of the committeemen on patrol joined them. Clara decided she could now safely reveal her identity to them. Without indicating that she had any definite basis for suspicion, she questioned the men about their neighbor, Dr. Shook. He was a wealthy Oakland doctor, an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist, it developed. He was well known as a yachtsman, and he owned and flew his own private plane. One man mentioned that the doctor was very fond of cats, and had a number of them about his home. He had no dogs, so far as anyone knew, just cats. And since the poisoner apparently was interested only in dogs, and no cats were listed as victims, Dr. Shook had not been invited to join the Dog Lovers Committee, and hence knew little or nothing about its activities. He was understood, moreover, to be a very busy man in his medical practice, and hence took no part in the neighborhood affairs. Clara gleaned what facts she could about Dr. Shook, but kept her own counsel regarding what she and her operative had seen that afternoon. The next day, Miller kept watch in Orinda, on the off chance that the poisoner would strike on another day other than Thursday, while Clara went to Oakland to dig up further information on Dr. Shook from various routine sources, including physicians who might be mutual friends. It was about that time that the leaders of the committee, Bruner, Wright, Hodgkins, and Kales, cooked up their great idea. For some weeks now, no dogs had actually fallen victims to the poison. The neighborhood was so thoroughly on guard that all dogs were kept in safe places. But by the same token, it became more difficult to lay traps for the poisoner, since, with no dogs on the loose in any particular place, there was no telling where he would be most likely to plant his poison. One place was as good as another for his purposes. The committeemen discussed the idea of letting a well-trained dog out as a decoy and following him till the poisoner should approach him. But when it came to a showdown, no one was willing to risk his dog for such a purpose. There might be some slip-up, and the dog might go for the poisoned meat. So the determined dog owners evolved the novel idea of making a phonographic recording of a dog's bark to use as a decoy. One of them had the necessary sound recording and amplifying equipment. they secretly conveyed it to a nearby veterinary establishment, where they selected the dog with the most vigorous and penetrating bark, and encouraged him to demonstrate his ability while they made a recording. That same night, they set up the equipment in Wright's yard near the low fence next to the road. One of them hid in the bushes to change the record and attend to the equipment, while the others, armed with shotguns and clubs, lurked behind trees. Into the small hours of the morning, the synthetic barking kept up, invitingly close to the fence and far from the house, but the elusive poisoner did not show up. The next day, the committeemen took Detective Bloom, Constable Stowe, and District Attorney Healy into their confidence, and Clara was duly informed of the setup. The dog owners kept up the ruse, night after night, switching the sound equipment from one yard to another. Mechanically minded now, they even rigged up flashlight cameras among the trees to be tripped by threads strung close to the ground. But still no one fell into their trap. Neither was any more deadly meat found, which was not surprising since another Thursday had not come around. Over Christmas and into the next week, the phantom dog barked nightly. By the next Thursday, Clara Prather had accumulated quite a bit of information about Dr. Francis M. Shook. While he was devoted to his several cats, his colleagues agreed that he had often expressed his aversions to dogs. He specially disliked dogs that barked at night. When he moved to Orinda, he had said he was moving to the suburban foothills in search of peace and quiet. Clara uncovered the interesting fact that the Orinda poisonings had begun shortly after Dr. Shook had returned from an extended vacation. Prior to that, there had been no more than the usual reports of occasional accidental poisoning of pets by meat, set out by farmers to trap predatory animals. Most significant of all, Clara discovered that Dr. Shook's day off from his duties, his day of rest, was Thursday. So when next Thursday came, Clara took up her vigil early in the afternoon, down the road from Fairway Acres, while Miller and another operative, Jack Foster, were posted at strategic points along Minor Road near the Wright and Bruner estates. Since the nocturnal phantom barking had centered in this area, they calculated that it was most likely that the poisoner would return to it on his weekly mission of death. In mid-afternoon, Dr. Shook got out of his Cadillac and, obviously not suspecting anything, drove to nearby Walnut Creek, with Clara close behind him. He went into a meat shop, where Clara watched him purchase 2 pounds of beef steak. He drove home and came out again shortly before dusk. Clara followed the Cadillac down Minor Road as before. At 3 or 4 points, Dr. Shook slowed to a crawl. Clara kept her distance and slowed in turn. There was no need for her to search for the poison to meet, since she knew that her operatives and possibly others had the whole vicinity covered. After cruising the length of Minor Road, Dr. Shook turned around and drove back home just as darkness fell. The phantom barkings began, but he did not emerge again. Clara's 2 excited operatives joined her on the dark road outside Fairway Acres. "We've got 'em dead to rights this time," Miller exulted. "I was hiding behind a tree when he passed the Wright's place. I saw the whole thing. He slowed down 3 times, came almost to a stop by that little gully. The first time he slowed, I saw his arm come out of the left front window. I didn't actually see his movements the other 2 times. He was too far away, and it was getting dark. But as soon as he'd passed, with you coming along right after him, I ran over to the spots where he had slowed, and I found 6 pieces of meat, 3 in one place, 2 in another, 1 in another. There was 1 piece at the place where I saw his arm go out in a throwing motion. The meat was fresh, here it is, you can see, and I looked at those spots less than half an hour before, and I'm prepared to swear that there was no meat there then." But you didn't actually see him throw it? Well, no, it was too dark, but his was the only car that stopped, and I saw his arm go out, and I found the meat. I'm prepared to swear he threw it. What more do you want? Why don't we get the constable and arrest him right now?" Clara shook her head. "It won't do. Our evidence has to be absolutely airtight. We all know he's our man, but we may have to convince a jury. A high-priced lawyer might be able to persuade the jury that you didn't see enough to convict him. They'll say the meat was already there, and that he was just waving his hand, that he drives around on Thursday nights just for a breath of air. No, I guess we'll have to wait till next week and hope for better luck." The next day, Clara went to see District Attorney Healy and reported her findings, complete with a detailed map of Dr. Shook's movements and of the spots where the meat was found. To make absolutely certain, Healy sent the suspected chunks of meat to the University of California laboratories at Berkeley for an official analysis, and was informed that they contained enough strychnine to kill a score of dogs. "Well, Clara," Healy said, "it looks as though we've got our man identified, but we're still far from having a case against him. You were smart last night not to tip him off or make any move. We have to move carefully. We're not dealing with any low-grade criminal here. Dr. Shook is a smart man and a rich man." Healy called in several of the dog owners and told them of Clara's findings. Detective Bloom came with them and disclosed that he and his men had also, independently of Clara, picked up the trail of the gray-haired doctor. They had noted the suspicious movements of his car. It was agreed that there was now no doubt of Dr. Shook's guilt. That night, Bloom and his operatives, as well as Clara's forces, concentrated on watching Dr. Shook's place, keeping tabs on his every move. Detectives climbed trees to watch the grounds of Fairway Acres with night glasses. At the same time, Bruner and Wright brought up their sound equipment to the newly established front line. They set up the equipment in a clump of bushes 100 yards from Dr. Shook's house, and through the night hours, the phantom howls and barks floated up toward the suspect's window. But there was no reaction. They kept this up all week, over the New Year holiday. Dr. Shook came and went about his business, and nightly the ghostly dog barked near his window, but he made no move even to investigate the barking. As the nights went by, some of the watchers theorized that perhaps the poisoner had abandoned his activities since he had met with no success in recent weeks. The poisoned meat had been picked up by detectives as fast as he planted it. One of the dog owners remarked grimly that perhaps the poisoner had been frightened into reform by the eerie and constant barking, which he might well take to be the ghostly voices of the dogs he had killed. But Clara bided her time and clung to her theory that the poisoner was a creature of habit and would only operate on Thursday, his day off from regular work. At dusk on Thursday, January 4th, 1940, the trap was set up as usual. Clara waited down the road in her car, while a posse headed by Melvin Myatt, Healy's investigator, was scattered at strategic points just outside Dr. Shook's grounds. Constable Stowe was on hand, abetted by Clara's operatives, Miller and Foster, whom he had sworn in as special deputies. Harry Bloom and several of his operatives were there. The field telephone had been set up to connect the outposts. More elaborate preparations could not have been made to trap the most desperate criminal. Darkness fell and lights went on in Dr. Shook's residence. It was a clear, starlit night. The phantom dog began its barking from the bushes. In a short while, Dr. Shook emerged from the back of his house. He was wearing old clothes and carried a pickaxe. He started digging in the ground near the house. From time to time he looked up and stared long in the direction of the bush from which the barking came. At length he shouldered his pickaxe and started working along the edge of his property toward the source of the sound. He stepped over the boundaries of Fairway Acres and continued on toward the clump of dense brush at the edge of the woods. As he neared the brush, a flashlight suddenly sprang to life, silhouetting him in its glare, and 3 men surrounded him. He uttered a strangled cry and made as though to swing at them with a pickaxe. They seized him and overpowered him. He ceased struggling as soon as Myatt and other officers identified themselves. "I thought you were robbers," he gasped, "when you jumped on me like that. But what's wrong? What do you want?" The possemen did not answer him for a moment. "Over this way," one of them called. "He threw it over here. I saw his hand go out." More flashlights were switched on. More men crowded around, and Clara drove up and turned her headlights on the scene. On the ground a few yards from where the officers had seized the doctor lay a fresh chunk of meat with the telltale white powder. "What's this all about?" Dr. Shook was demanding. When they told him he was under arrest for dog poisoning, he continued to protest his innocence. He denied flatly that he had tossed the piece of meat toward the bushes just before the flashlight went on. "I was just walking over here to dig up a tree for my grounds," he maintained. "I heard the dog barking, but I didn't pay any attention to it. I don't know anything about poisoned meat." But the possemen were ready to swear that they had seen him throw the meat on the ground. After his first outburst, the elderly physician fell glumly silent. They took him to the county jail at Martinez, where Myatt signed a complaint and booked him for violation of the Penal Code section dealing with the poisonings of animals, a misdemeanor punishable by a stiff fine or a county jail term. His bail was set at $1,000. He was allowed to telephone a friend, who shortly appeared with the bail, and the doctor, badly shaken by his experience, was released. The arrest of the well-known doctor created a furor throughout the East Bay area. His neighbors were about equally divided between those who demanded immediate and heavy-handed justice and those who refused to believe that the distinguished, soft-spoken, gray-haired physician could be guilty of such a crime. Dr. Shook retained 2 prominent attorneys to defend him and issued a public statement categorically denying his guilt. "I've been spending my spare time digging along a water line on my property, trying to locate a certain branch line," he said. "Thursday night I located the branch soon after I started digging. Since I had my old clothes on and the pickaxe handy, I thought I'd go up into the brush and dig up a little laurel tree to plant on my place. That's where I was going when these men jumped out at me. I remember I had just shaken some mud off my hands, and if they thought they saw me throw something on the ground, that's what it was." District Attorney Healy, on the other hand, was convinced that Dr. Shook had deliberately set out to poison the dog whose barks he heard in the brush, not knowing it was the phantom recording. He believed that the doctor had worn old clothes and made a pretense of digging in order to throw off suspicion if anyone were watching. During the several weeks while Dr. Shook awaited trial, there were no more dogs poisoned and no more lethal meat found. Healy took this as additional proof of Dr. Shook's guilt. The case aroused nationwide interest among dog lovers, and when Dr. Shook at length came to trial before Justice of the Peace Clifford Thompson at Walnut Creek, the court had to move its quarters to the town's little theater to accommodate the crowd of partisan spectators. Socialite dog owners were jammed elbow to elbow with farmers from the countryside in the small auditorium. Batteries of legal counsel on either side and newspapermen from all over the West filled half the space. When Dr. Shook appeared looking aged and ill, he was both cheered and booed. The attorneys wrangled bitterly over the selection of the jury, and 3 panels were exhausted before 6 men and 6 women were chosen to fill the box. The defense attorneys asked dismissal on the grounds that illegal provocative tactics had been employed in the use of the phantom dog bark, and that the doctor could not be accused of attempted dog poisoning since there had been no dog in the neighborhood of his arrest. Deputy District Attorney Wakefield Taylor, on the other hand, said his evidence would link Dr. Shook with the previous poisoning attempts and declared, Dr. Shook originally moved to Orinda with a preconceived notion of poisoning all dogs in the area. Justice Thompson ruled that the trial should proceed. Clara Prather and her operatives and other detectives were ready with their evidence, but before the first witness was called, Dr. Shook decided to give up the battle. His attorneys offered to plead him guilty to an amended charge of exposing poisoned meat without a label. They explained that he was suffering greatly mentally and physically, and that the strain of the trial might be dangerous to him. They admitted that he had put out the poisoned meat on January 4th, but contended that this was the first time, and that he had done it only when driven to distraction by the mechanical barking under his window night after night, that he had thought a wild dog was running loose in the brush. They denied that he was responsible for the previous poisonings, which caused the deaths of more than 40 dogs. District Attorney Healy, considering the doctor's failing health and feeling that the ends of justice had been served by his arrest with its attendant-wide publicity, agreed to accept the compromise rather than engage in a long court battle. Justice Thompson accepted the guilty plea and fined Dr. Shook $100. There were no more poisonings, and the dogs of Orinda were free to ramble about the countryside once more. On December 27, 1940, Dr. Shook died of a blood clot after a major operation.